show me what his plan and his will is. He's now using it to show me what it's going to be like in the future.
I arrived at our childhood family property, a huge 4-suite apartment building on East 124th Street in Cleveland, Ohio. It was originally owned by and was the former dwelling of my grandparents, Cleve and Eva Horn, who then transferred ownership to my parents, who moved there later in their lives. Also, most of my siblings, except for my middle brother, G-Man, and many of our cousins, in-laws, and friends ultimately spent time as residents in this building. It appeared that almost every other property in close proximity to our family building had all been destroyed, with dry, open fields all around it. And there was a crowd of people outside, and they were there on what seemed to be a huge restoration and expansion project. People were gathered in the front and all around the sides and the back of the building. There were carpenters, painters, plumbers, and all sorts of contractors and technicians, pounding and hammering away, sawing and chopping, drilling and hauling materials. As I walked up to the front entrance of the building, someone hollered my name to get my attention. When I looked back, it was my dad, holding a huge piece of wood, and he was beckoning for me to come to the cutting table where he was, and he had a saw in his hand. My dad said, "Here, son, I need for you to cut out the door that will be the entranceway for the building." I told my dad that I don't have much experience in carpentry other than those few times when there was no one else to do things at our church when we were growing up, and later when I became pastor of his church. My dad encouraged me and told me there was no worries at all whatsoever, and that he knows that I remember how to get the job done. He then handed me the saw after he had measured out some areas on the piece of wood. I remember telling my dad that so many people had been in and out of that building over the years that there was no way that the door that he first measured out for me would be large enough to allow free space for all of those who would return when the restoration is completed. Dad said, "Then, son, you make that door as big as it needs to be, and it don't even need to be perfect. Put that door up there that you believe will work the best to get everybody back in here." I took the saw from the hand of my father and began to cut out the wood for the door based on what I imagined would be necessary and adequate for the building. I cut it, but it was not according to the pattern that my dad had originally outlined for me. By the time I was done cutting and trimming the wood for the door, it was huge and out of shape and had no certain outline to its boundaries. I then took the door and drilled out the holes for the screws and then hung the door on the front of the building. At that time that I was doing this, I didn't realize that I had a small audience of my granddad, Daddy Cleve, my parents, and my Uncle Bobby Ray. My Uncle Bob said to my dad, "That door looks a mess. That's not how it's supposed to look. Who did that for that boy, Jesse Lee?" My dad's name being Jesse Lee. My granddad sniggled and giggled, along with my Uncle Bob. But my mom then looked over at my granddad and my uncle with disgust. My dad then responded to my uncle and said, "Tiger cut that dough," referring to me by my nickname of Tiger. "And he cut it how he saw fit for it to be. more of our older family members, along with some of the veteran contractors in the yard, started drawing nearer to the front of the building where I was working to also spectate, to laugh, and to profess their doubts about such a door that had no design and that was not cut from any specific pattern. Some hollered, "It'll never work," while others proclaimed that the door would never be opened or used, saying that, "Well, folk just gonna find another way in, or they gonna turn around and not come in at all." They started to vex me, but the more they vexed my soul, the more my dad encouraged me to just keep on working on it, son. My mom was quiet and observant, but she never took her eyes off of me while I was hanging the door. Anyone that knew my mom knows that she's never quiet. Her quiet moments were preserved for only one thing, and that was when she was hearing from God. She was always my biggest cheerleader, and in this moment, her quietness was my indicator that God was revealing to her that nothing or no one would stop me from finishing the work that my dad had put in my hands. Soon, the front yard was completely full, and the street was packed with cars and people who had come from everywhere, as I had successfully hung the door of the building and had it fitted perfectly into place. One by one, people of all shapes and sizes, heights and weights, rich and poor, black and white, young and old, whosoever touched that door was able to walk through the door freely and devoid of any obstruction. It was an effortless entry for all. The rest of the restoration work and expansion was still going on, but that never stopped the masses of people going into the building. They just never stopped coming in. As they walked through the yard and into the building, every man grabbed a hammer and nails, or a bucket of paint and brushes. They hauled wood and drywall and joined in with us who was laboring. The women and the children ran throughout the building, washing walls and spraying fragrances and hanging pictures and curtains, all while laughing and singing those same sweet songs of the goodness and greatness of God. Those same songs that we heard as a child, that my grandmother and my mother used to sing while cooking over the stove. One of the best parts that I remember from this dream is that no matter how long the labor took, the sun stayed bright all day. Morning, noon, evening, night. As long as we labored, the sun never went down. And the more that we labored, the more that the people kept on coming in. So the work never ceased, because expansion had to always continue. I find it interesting that this undisciplined door that had not been cut from the pattern and without any design, it never closed. It's funny when you think that the very thing that allows access to exit is yet the very thing that allows access to enter in. We often focus on all the ways of how to get everyone out of the building. But in this dream, there was much focus on how to get everyone into it. And it started at that door. In St. John 10, Jesus states in his profound discourse of the shepherd and the sheep these words: "Most assuredly I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber." He later says, "Most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep." He's letting them in. So we're letting them in. Because sometimes, my friends, it's as simple as in how you frame the door. If we build it, they'll come. And it is so.